easy to give a lecture on the matter of Blavatsky and her relationship to science. Her work was so broadly cast, an immense spectrum of knowledge spread across time and space, and therefore it is inevitable that everybody sometime in life comes across a matter that Blavatsky dealt with, usually in great depth, because that was her way. And traditionally I like to introduce the subject with my own early recollections of several matters that she dealt with exhaustively. And the first, of course, is the matter of our moon. Quite a huge body that occupies so much space that we can hardly ignore it like we can the stars. And Blavatsky did not ignore it. She used it as a basis for many of her outstanding propositions which affect man psychologically and spiritually as well. When I went to school as a little boy, Durban High School, it was a good one, we were taught that the moon had come out of the Pacific, that somehow or the other great heavenly structure had shot past the earth, and the earth had bulged in the direction of this object, and part of the earth had been torn away, and that this later became the basis of the moon's integration into more or less a planet of its own. It was startling, exciting to new kids on the science block, and seemed very credible. After all, they said it had come out of the area where there was the Pacific, and the Pacific is an inexplicable large sheet of ocean, and the suggestion there seemed plausible. Well, of course, it was absolute nonsense. Madame Blavatsky said that the moon condensed out of its own rim of solar material, just as the Earth had done. And she had said that the moon had been much closer to the Earth than it is today, about 250,000 miles away. It had been much closer to the Earth and had left its effects on the Earth as a result of this closeness. It's not easy to keep our times in the time scale in a proper order. She was talking obviously about hundreds of millions of years ago, and it would be nice to say that the fact that the female cycle is still 28 days is related to the moon's phases, cycle, rotating around the Earth, moving around the Earth. But it is unlikely because the short period of man taking the esoteric proposition that man has been on the Earth about 12, 13, 14 million years, it's unlikely that the moon would have moved from such close an apposition in that short a time, considering that the Earth is about 5 billion years old. But there's no doubt about it, the moon did affect the Earth profoundly, and Madame Blavatsky suggested that the moon was like a mother to the Earth to begin with, and then later the roles were reversed, and the Earth began to draw off the life forces from the moon. And she gives very good, explicable reasons for this, why the roles should have been reversed. And they do explain in esoteric language many of the difficulties that are associated with our origins. We'll come to that in a moment. Now, Madame Blavatsky had, as you know, written the most profound and basic work of the Theosophical Society, which has ensured its survival more than any other factor that I can think of, and that is the writing of the Mahatma letters. I don't have to talk down to an audience like you who know your bread and butter theosophy, but the work is in the British Museum, and it is very profound indeed, and also very futuristic. Again, this broad spectrum of presentation in terms of time and space show themselves. Madame Blavatsky had written, she said, or her pen had been guided by two Mahatmas, one on the first ray of will and power, whose writing was rather vicious, a bit like mine, almost unreadable, and a lord of the second ray, Kutumi Lal Singh, whose writing flowed beautifully and represented the style of the second ray of love wisdom. These things you know. The letters that I want to refer to is where the Lord Kutumi said, the moon is far, far older than the earth, which is a direct contradiction of what I have just said and illustrated by a diagram, that if the earth had been properly constituted, as it must have been if there was a Pacific, and if there were continents, oceans, and for a heavenly body to tear a part of it away and still survive. So this was one of the ways in which she contradicted science. And when I picked up the secret doctrine 60 years after it had been written, there's no doubt in my mind she was right. And the way that we have been able to show that she was right is that we have sent, as you know, astronauts to the moon, and they brought back moon rocks. We have sent satellites to the moon, and astronauts landed on the moon, I should say, and they came later. And they were able to bring back rocks from the moon, and these rocks on examination showed quite clearly that they were certainly millions of years older than any rocks on the Earth. And the current attitude of NASA scientists who have done most of the research work lately on the moon, their findings seem to be absolutely correct, that these, in the early days of the moon, when the great sea of lava covered virtually the whole of the moon's surface, which would be the fire mists probably of the moon's first round, whereas the Earth had hardly formed a planet at all, that pieces of rock had floated to the surface, and these were very, very old indeed. And so it was the astronauts who showed that Blavatsky was right, that the moon was older than the Earth. And she had written, of course, 70 years previously, which was an incredible feat, to be able to state outright that the moon was older than the Earth. But she went further, and she said there was life on the moon, and that life had reached almost human levels. And following up that, of course, with observations by our clairvoyant Leadbeater and others, we have maintained that the life that nearly reached human levels on the moon was transferred millennia later into the Earth's globe D. And still to this day we say that there are lunar types in the psychology of human behavior. More than that, I assert, certainly in following on daily, that it is possible to recognize some of the physical resemblances that were reflected to the Earth from the moon types that evolved. And the moon went through a period that was very, very short, probably only in a matter looking very carefully into the whole affair of the moon. Life could only have existed coherently, productively, for a period of probably 400 million years. And then the moon went through a series of disasters which made life's survival on the moon impossible. And so all that happened on the moon would have had to have happened in the first billion years. And the moon, being older than the Earth, would be 5 billion years old today. And nevertheless, in that very short period early in the life of the moon, there had been these structures formed, and animal life also was transferred to the Earth. And my own particular line of investigation showed that the marsupials, now seen in Australia, were one of the closest likenesses to moon animal types produced particularly in the third round on the moon, rather than the fourth, which would have been the fourth kingdom humans. And the size of the marsupial, we call the kangaroo, the size of the head and the enormous leaping capacities characterizes, of course, still to this day, the low gravity of the moon, and the way that our own astronauts had to jump rather than to walk on the moon. Beautiful, rich background. Lunar human types were in trouble. They had manifested through unindividualized animal states in the third round on the moon, and technically should have been able to materialize human form on the moon in the fourth round, which was, after all, as I said earlier, the round of the human kingdom. But the conditions of the moon had by then deteriorated tremendously. Animal life was being driven underground. The way in which the moon was destroyed was partly volcanically, but mainly through pounding by meteorites. And there's hardly a spot on the surface of the moon today that you can put a pin in between craters. Craters, craters, craters everywhere. And these craters were from meteorites and who knows what else that blasted the surface of the moon and killed the Logos, destroyed the Logos of the moon, who, according to our calculations, would have been something like, in human terms, 17 years of age, and was male. The effect of the pounding was to smash the surface of the moon, which had had life on it, but there was now formed what we call a regolith. By that we mean anything up to 60 meters deep surface of the moon, made up of broken rock fragments and dust, moon dust, there today. But there would have been many places where life could have sheltered, where there would have been still water and warmth coming from the center of the moon. But then other disasters occurred later. The great craters that had formed on the moon now began to undergo a process of covering to form what we call the mare. The mare, a sea, Latin word for a sea, mare plural. And what happened was that the closeness of the earth at that time was such that when volcanoes began to erupt, as the core of the moon became very hot and began to spew out the lava, the earth attracted the lava. It, in my words, rather dramatically put, degutted the moon of lava. And the lava spilled out and filled the great craters of the moon with lava, so that today we see these as dark patches on the surface of the moon, the mares of the moon being condensed lava rock today. And so there's no question about it that if there was life on the moon, it would have been in the first billion years, certainly not towards the end of it. But it came at a critical time, because as the fourth round struggled to materialize a human, etherically, yes, astrally, yes, had reached those stages by means of earlier globes and earlier rounds. But the ability to materialize a gas, liquid, solid, physical structure, I doubt it. And certainly there'd be no evidence of it were man to look for it. But some animal types survive. This is the astounding thing, and I suppose my reputation will hang on it for the next 50 years. Some insects survive the pounding on the moon. And as man begins to explore the moon, to drill, as they're bound to drill, hoping for you-know-what, oil and things like that, these remains will be found, and even some persistent living insects will be discovered in the regolith or below the regolith of the moon. But as the moon's rounds were halted, the fourth round stopped, there was beginning to evolve on Earth, the Earth's early rounds, second round, where there were all kinds of human semblances, wraith-like humans on the Earth who were producing their young by a budding process, where there was a swelling in what we would call the abdomen and a discrete area forming and separating, egg-like if you like. And Blavatsky gives beautiful descriptions of these unfolding earth types through the different rounds. They coincided with the ability to accept what had been produced on the moon. The moon structures were unable to go further in the physical plane because the physical surface of the moon was destroyed, but continued into their fifth, sixth, and seventh rounds, and underwent a reprise, a repeat of what they had formed in the descending arc that marked the first, second, third, fourth round. Now in the fifth, sixth, and seventh rounds on the moon, none of them operating physically anymore because there was no physical possibilities on the surface of the moon. They did a reprise of these earlier formations. And so they were ready to be transferred to the Earth, and the Earth became the new vehicle, the new incarnation for the lunar logos, reincarnating again on the Earth, and the Earth drawing from the moon, vampirizing the moon, Blavatsky called it, drawing off all the influences that the moon had. Very early in the moon's life, when life was struggling to form there, and did successfully at first, the moon had a magnetic field. But through various processes of pounding and so on, had lost its magnetic field. Madame Blavatsky had been a fond lover of magnetism, and from what I can make out through various quotations, she was quite insistent, as I am today, insistent that magnetism has to be present. Magnetism must be present, and it must be a global magnetism on any globe for life to have any kind of productive development and meaningful development. And she said that the lunar magnetism was essential to life on the moon, creatively, for the maintenance of life as well, and ultimately for its destruction. Of course, the Earth had a very powerful magnetic field compared to the moon. And the essential thing about magnetic fields is, especially globular, global magnetic fields, is that it enables what is essential for life to begin on any globe, whether it is a planetary globe or a lunar globe. By that I mean any moon. And that is, a magnetic field must be there before the devas can anchor themselves. The moment the devas anchor themselves, then it's possible for the life waves to begin to flow through that particular globe. I did some interesting work with the Delaware laboratories at Oxford in the 1960s. George De la Warr was an extraordinary genius. He could instrument for anything. He could measure anything. He could measure what we give off in our auras, almost any energy that we produce or change in energy production. George De la Warr could measure. And he evolved on this basis extraordinary instruments, and I have one of the original as part of my, today it's a museum. And this instrument was able to diagnose conditions of sick people. You could send your blood spot on a piece of blotting paper, to the Delaware laboratories, and I was medical advisor there and particularly interested in this aspect of his research. You could send your blood spot there, and they would put it into this diagnostic instrument. They would turn a series of resistors to tune it into the blood spot, and also a magnet, always a bar magnet there, which provided a magnetic field, and the resistors provided an electrical component, so that you then had electromagnetism in this device that could be tuned into human reactions. That was the important thing. And Mrs. De la Warr was a fine clinician, and she had a rate for every human disorder that she knew existed. And it was possible for them to put rates up or change the rate until they got a resistance. And this was shown to them by means of a stick pad. The whole machine was tuned into a rubber diaphragm, and as you stroked this pad and there was no reaction, your finger ran across the pad quite smoothly. The moment that your tuning into the blood spot reached a critical level, the pad became sticky and it caught your fingers, and you knew that you were close to a diagnosis of what that the person from whom the blood spot had been taken was suffering from. That's another field of investigation altogether. But it was important because it showed me that the presence of a magnetic field and these other forces of electrical nature through resistors had to be there in order to register life processes, whatever the life processes' qualities were. And so Blavatsky's words became meaningful to me, that only if there is a magnetic field there is life going to be possible to be implanted. And these things are terribly important today because we're going out to explore the solar system and possibly to colonize. And if you're going to establish something which is going to be existential to the moon or to Mars then they must have their own magnetic field, at least locally, if not globally. And so magnetism, and you know, when you say, well, where is the proof of the de-gutting of the moon by the Earth? It was only a few years ago that Mount St. Helens in Washington State had undergone an explosion, and it had been noted that the explosion had occurred when the moon was closest to the Earth. That the explosion had occurred when the moon was closest and therefore exerting its gravitational pull. And the gravitational pull would have been two ways. It pulls something out of the volcano crater. And somebody said it could happen again when the moon comes close. One of the scientists said, if that happens again with the moon close, it'll set science back another 30 years or something. And sure enough, when the moon came close again 28 and a quarter days later, the volcano went up again. And that indicates that this kind of thing, if the volcano on the moon had been quiescent, it probably wouldn't have let its lava out. But with the lava there and the intense attraction, it could have shot out in the way that I've suggested. Fascinating subject. The importance of the De la Warr laboratories today was that they were photographing dark matter, the dark matter of science, what we call in ancient wisdom subtle matter. And we in ancient wisdom, of course, have lived with subtle matter for millennia. We have organized what we have observed into the different planes and subplanes, and characterized those planes by different forms of life possible on them. There are whole books written about it in your own literature, theosophical literature. But here is science, unable to discover it under a microscope, sending rockets into outer space or into space, and picking up, detecting magnetic fields, and through these magnetic fields discovering subtle matter way out there in the universe, interpenetrating galaxies, the etheric body of the galaxy. We have an etheric body to the earth. The ancients called it the anima mundi of the earth. And science is confused, because here is science as being telling me at school and you what the laws of physics are, and basing those laws of physics on their knowledge of 1/10 of matter. It's like you examining a raincoat on somebody and trying to describe the physical body inside. That's what science has been doing for 200 years, and laying down laws about it, merely looking at 1/10 of the universe, 1/10 of the substance, qualities of the substance of the universe. They won't admit that, of course, but that's the truth. So this was Madame Blavatsky. She also talked about a second moon. She talked about a second moon, and in her volume 5 of The Secret Doctrine, which, sitting in your room downstairs, I saw all the other volumes, but I didn't see volume 5 there. Maybe it was hiding. But in volume 5 she said there was a second moon, and it had been seen by early populations on the earth. And finally it was seen to move slowly behind the present moon and was not seen again. Any talk of a second moon is important because I understand she forecast that a second moon, not this one, our one, would appear and would accept a population or develop a population in the 7th round. We all hazard guesses, of course, and who knows. This is speculative. Maybe the second moon will be something we build and will be the basis of a life that will be contained perhaps several million years from now. Who knows? How could there have been a second moon and not been spotted? Well, we know that the surface of the moon was pounded, literally pounded, by these immense meteorites that bashed it again and again. We must assume that the far side of the moon was also bashed. And gravity is very, very low on the moon, 1/5 of the Earth. And the pounding of the already made brittle surface of the Earth on the dark side might have chipped away a large fragment, perhaps 100 miles in diameter, that would have shot off the surface of the moon and could account for the second moon that Madame Blavatsky described. You see what a fascinating source of material this secret doctrine can still provide, especially if we update and put into contemporary language, scientific language, many of her observations. At the same time, she made another astounding forecast. She said that science would begin to hear heavenly bodies, stars up there, long before it could see them, which, when she wrote it, was ridiculous, of course. But within 40 years of her statement in the Mahatma letters, they were beginning to build radio telescopes. And the great radio telescopes, especially after the war, began to detect radio waves, all kinds of electromagnetic waves, coming not from our own galaxy, the Milky Way, in which our star is not a particularly prominent one, but from way out extragalactic sources. And these are what we call the quasars. They are quasi-stars, if you like, which give off sometimes radio waves, other waves as well, and their sources unknown. They're so far away. They come from light years away, 10 to the power of 10, which means 1 and 4 more noughts. Light years away. Light years away. Incredible distances, and yet only possibly from a neighboring galaxy. But that's how it is to this day. There are these objects out there in space, and some are X-rays, giving off X-rays, and we are able to pick them up in these great radio discs, collecting discs, and make some sort of sense out of them. When I was at medical school, Jodrell Bank was just over the road from where I was in Sheffield, and I went over to Jodrell Bank with my great friend Lady Forbes and met Sir Bernard Lovell there, and he took us over the whole caboose there, and it was fascinating in those days. I was interested because Bailey was talking about the hidden planets of the solar system, our solar system, suggesting, of course, that out there in space there are the globe A, globe B, globe C, as well as the visible globe D, and globe E, and globe F, and globe G, making up chains of globes. Our Earth is globe D of a chain of 7. And esoteric Buddhism was supposed to capitulate all this. My own investigation shows that while, yes, you can describe these globes as existing in their own planes of mental, astral, etheric substance, I don't see them as separated from each other. Interpenetrating each other, yes. Distinct globes because they act on their particular plane only for the life on them, yes. But not separated from each other by several million miles or something like that. And that is probably one of the directions that theosophy will need to take in the next millennia to clean up its act. One of the things that needs to be cleaned up, and I think I've taken part in that very recently in my new book, Life on Other Planets, is the mistake that was made quite clearly when Leadbeater took Mars to be part of our own Earth chain. Is that right, Lawrence? It was a mistake, and he